Wash my clothes and make breakfast, demanded my husband's niece, who was living free in my apartment. She threw dirty underwear at my face and I instantly shoved it into her mouth. My husband jumped up, but the truth he was about to face would ruin his entire life. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and subscribe if you have ever dealt with a toxic family. I am Kendra, 34 years old, and for the last 3 years I have played the role of the quiet, grateful wife. My husband Marcus always thought he was the savior in our marriage. He actually believed his background made him superior to a dark-skinned woman with locks who grew up in a historic neighborhood. What he never bothered to learn was that my silence was not submission, it was strategy. It was a Tuesday morning, and sunlight was hitting the marble countertops of my penthouse. I was standing in the kitchen savoring the hum of the espresso machine when Brittany stomped in. She was 19, my husband's niece and a college student who had been crashing in my home for 6 months. She stood there with her hands on her hips, her blonde hair messy from sleep, wearing an expensive silk robe she had stolen from my closet. "I said wash these and make me breakfast!" Brittany screeched, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I have a seminar at 10 and I absolutely refuse to eat scrambled eggs again. Make me something better." Before I could process the audacity of her demand, she hurled a crumpled, foul-smelling pair of lace underwear directly at my head. The fabric slapped against my cheek and fell onto the island counter. For a fraction of a second, the room went completely still. I did not scream. I did not cry. Running a holding company had taught me that whoever loses their temper first loses the war. I grabbed the lace. I walked slowly around the kitchen island. Brittany crossed her arms, expecting me to carry her laundry like a maid. Instead, I grabbed her by the jaw, squeezed just hard enough to make her gasp, and shoved the dirty underwear straight into her mouth. Brittany shrieked, stumbling backward. She hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, coughing and gagging as she yanked the fabric out of her mouth. Genuine tears of shock welled in her eyes. "Kendra, are you out of your absolute mind?" Marcus came sprinting out of the master bedroom, aggressively buttoning his designer dress shirt. He rushed to Brittany, dropping to his knees to pull his niece into his arms. He glared up at me, his face red with disbelief and fury. "She is just a teenager!" Marcus yelled, his voice cracking. "How dare you put your hands on her like that?" I looked down at the two of them, brushing a stray lock over my shoulder. A 19-year-old adult who has been living free in my space just threw her panties at my face. "You had better teach your niece how to speak to the owner of this house, Marcus. If you do not, I will personally throw her and her garbage out onto the street." Marcus stood up, his chest heaving. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "The owner? You really think you are the owner? You need to check your attitude, Kendra. You should be thanking God every day that a man like me gave you a ring. I elevated you. I took a dark-skinned girl with a rough background and brought you into my family. You would be nothing without my last name. Do not ever forget that." I let out a low, cold laugh. "You elevated me. You think your generic bank manager salary elevated me?" "I am done with your disrespect," Marcus interrupted, puffing out his chest to assert his dominance. "You want to talk about who owns this place? Well, I have some news for you. Last week I sat down with my lawyer. I transferred the deed of this entire penthouse into a private trust. It is in the name of Brittany now. Consider it my college gift to my favorite niece." Brittany sniffled from the floor, a nasty, triumphant grin slowly replacing her tears. She looked up at me, clearly waiting for me to break down. "That is right," Marcus sneered, crossing his arms. "I am the man of this household and I make the financial decisions. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your clothes and get out of my niece's apartment. If you are not gone by tomorrow, I will have the police escort you out." They both stared at me, waiting for the hysterical sobbing, the begging, the desperate pleas for forgiveness. They expected me to crumble. I simply turned my back to them, walked over to the espresso machine and poured my dark roast into a ceramic mug. I took a long, slow sip, letting the rich flavor coat my tongue. The silence in the kitchen stretched out, becoming thick and uncomfortable. "Are you deaf?" Marcus barked, taking a step toward me. "I said you are evicted." I turned around, leaning casually against the marble counter. "That is a fascinating story, Marcus. It really is. But I have a quick question for you. When you went to your lawyer to forge that transfer document, did you actually read the original deed to this penthouse?" Marcus blinked, his arrogant stance faltering for a fraction of a second. What are you talking about? My name is on the mortgage. Is it? I asked, taking another sip of coffee. If you had bothered to read the actual documents instead of signing the fake mortgage papers I handed you 3 years ago, you would know something very important. I set my mug down. This penthouse does not have a mortgage, Marcus, and it certainly does not belong to you. Before Marcus could stammer out a response to my revelation about the deed, the electronic lock on the front door beeped loudly. A sharp click echoed through the foyer, followed immediately by the sound of high heels clicking against the imported hardwood. I did not even have to turn around to know who had just let themselves into my home. Marcus had given them the spare access code exactly 1 year ago, despite my explicit instructions not to do so. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, strutted into the kitchen first. She was a woman who spent her entire life trying to erase her own blackness, wearing her hair bone straight and bleaching her skin until it looked perpetually bruised. Right behind her was Jessica, Marcus's white sister-in-law, and Brittany's mother. Jessica always carried herself with the absolute smug entitlement of a woman who knew her proximity to whiteness made her the undisputed prize in Evelyn's deeply colorist hierarchy. Evelyn rushed toward Brittany, completely ignoring my presence. She gasped dramatically, pulling the crying teenager into a tight embrace. She stroked Brittany's blonde hair, cooing soft words of comfort before shooting a venomous glare in my direction. "Look at what you have done to this precious girl," Evelyn hissed, her voice dripping with unmasked disgust. "I told Marcus from the very beginning that bringing a woman like you into our family was a massive mistake. You carry that aggressive energy everywhere you go. Just look at you. You have been married to my successful son for 3 years, and you still refuse to press your hair. You insist on walking around with those rough locks, embarrassing us in front of polite society. Brittany has delicate sensibilities, Kendra. She has superior genetics thanks to Jessica. She is not built for your kind of hostility." Jessica stepped forward, crossing her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater. She looked around my kitchen with an unmistakable sneer. "Honestly, Kendra, you should be packing your bags right now. Marcus already told us the good news. He finally stepped up and did what was best for his bloodline. He secured this property for my daughter. I suppose you can go back to that crumbling, rundown brownstone your grandmother left you in that dangerous neighborhood. It is where you belong anyway. You never fit in here among people of actual status." My grandmother's brownstone was a historic, fully renovated, multi-million-dollar property located in one of the most culturally rich districts in the entire city. It was the absolute foundation of my generational wealth. But to Evelyn and Jessica, anything associated with authentic Black history was inherently worthless. I watched as Jessica proudly patted the marble countertop, treating my home as her freshly conquered territory. "It is going to be so exceptionally nice to redecorate this place." Jessica gloated, a smug smile stretching across her pale face. "Brittany needs a proper study area, and we will replace these dark cabinets. They are far too ethnic. Thank you for keeping the place relatively clean, Kendra, but your time playing a wealthy housewife is officially over. Hand over the keys and the security fobs immediately. My daughter owns this penthouse now." I leaned forward, resting both hands flat against the cold marble of the island. I looked directly into Jessica's eyes and then shifted my gaze to Evelyn. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "Jessica, you are remarkably confident for a woman who clearly does not understand how corporate real estate law works," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Let us clarify a few fundamental facts for the room right now. Marcus did indeed visit a lawyer last week. He did sign a piece of paper that he believed was a transfer of ownership to your spoiled daughter. However, Marcus cannot transfer an asset he does not own, has never owned, and will never own." Evelyn scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Stop lying, you pathetic girl. My son is a branch manager at a prestigious bank. He makes the real money. His name is on the paperwork. You are just trying to save face because you are getting thrown out on the street. Your son makes $90,000 a year, Evelyn," I stated clearly, watching the blood drain from Marcus's face. "The monthly maintenance fees for this building alone cost more than his annual bonuses. The deed to this property is not in my name, and it is certainly not in his. This penthouse is actually owned by a corporate entity called Apex Holdings LLC. I bought this unit entirely in cash 4 years ago before I ever let your son put a ring on my finger. And I am the sole 100% shareholder of Apex Holdings. Jessica's smug expression evaporated instantly. She looked at Marcus, panic flickering in her pale eyes. Marcus, what is she talking about? You said you took care of this. You said Brittany owned the house. He lied. I continued, not letting Marcus speak, because his fragile ego could not handle the fact that his dark-skinned wife was quietly funding his entire lifestyle. The document he signed transferring ownership to Brittany legally, it was nothing more than a formal termination of his own residency. By signing that paper, Marcus officially surrendered his right to live in my corporate-owned property. He practically evicted himself. Brittany stopped crying. Evelyn stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of the refrigerator for support. Marcus was breathing heavily, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The grand illusion of his power, the fake kingdom he had built to impress his colorist mother and white sister-in-law, was shattering right in front of them. "You sneaky, manipulative witch," Marcus growled, taking a threatening step toward me. "You think you are so smart? You think you can just hide assets during our marriage? We live in an equitable distribution state, Kendra. If you want to play dirty, we will play dirty. I am filing for divorce today, and I am taking half of your little holding company. I am taking half of everything you own. You will be paying me alimony for the rest of your miserable life." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I reached into the pocket of my slacks, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen once to wake the display. "You can certainly try to take me to divorce court, Marcus," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "But before we divide the assets, do you want to explain to your mother and Jessica why you were escorted out of your bank by security 2 weeks ago? Or would you prefer to explain why the federal authorities are currently investigating your recent firing for massive corporate embezzlement?" Marcus stood frozen in the middle of my kitchen. The color completely drained from his face as the reality of his situation set in. He knew I was not bluffing. The federal investigation into his missing bank funds was real, and he knew I had the resources to bury him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His absolute silence was the confirmation Evelyn and Jessica needed. The fake empire he had sold them was crashing down, and they were going down with it. Jessica, however, was not ready to surrender. I watched her pale eyes dart frantically around my marble kitchen. She looked at Marcus, who was visibly shaking, and then she looked at me. A dangerous, calculated shift happened in her posture. She realized she could not intimidate me with wealth, and she could not evict me with fake documents. So she decided to use the oldest and most lethal weapon she had in her arsenal: her whiteness. Jessica reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her phone. Her hands were perfectly steady as she dialed 911. But the moment the dispatcher answered the call, her entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders slumped. Her breathing became ragged. She let out a loud theatrical sob that echoed through the penthouse. "Please help us!" Jessica screamed into the phone, her voice shaking with manufactured terror. "We need police right now. My daughter and I are being attacked. There is an aggressive black woman in our home and she is threatening to kill us. I think she has a weapon. Please hurry. She is completely out of control." Evelyn immediately understood the assignment. She grabbed Brittany by the arm and pulled the teenager into the corner of the kitchen, knocking over a bar stool in the process, to create the illusion of a struggle. Evelyn wrapped her arms around her granddaughter, burying her face in Brittany's shoulder, and began to wail loudly. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. They were painting a picture for the emergency dispatcher, creating a narrative that could easily end with me in handcuffs or worse. Marcus took a step back, wiping sweat from his forehead. He knew exactly what his sister-in-law was doing. He knew she was lying. He knew I did not have a weapon and had not made a single threat. Yet he said absolutely nothing. He let them weaponize my race and my presence in my own home because his bruised ego wanted to see me punished. "She is trapping us in the kitchen," Jessica cried into the phone, sinking to her knees to amplify her fake desperation. "We cannot get to the door. Please, she is going to hurt my baby." I did not move a muscle. I stood behind the kitchen island, holding my ceramic mug, watching this grotesque display of weaponized privilege. Any other woman might have panicked. Any other woman might have yelled at them to stop lying, which would have only provided the audio evidence the 911 dispatcher needed to confirm the narrative of an angry, aggressive woman. But I remained perfectly silent. I took a slow sip of coffee, maintaining steady eye contact with Jessica. I let her see that I was not afraid of her tears. The response time in the Gold Coast neighborhood is notoriously fast. Less than 4 minutes after Jessica hung up the phone, a heavy authoritative pounding echoed against my front door. Chicago Police Department opened the door. Before I could even set my mug down, Marcus scrambled past the kitchen island and sprinted down the hallway to open the double doors. Two police officers rushed into the foyer. Their hands were already resting firmly on their holsters. The tension in the room skyrocketed instantly. They stepped into the kitchen, their eyes scanning the scene, taking in the overturned bar stool, the sobbing blonde teenager, the weeping mother-in-law, and Jessica, who was now kneeling on the floor, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. "That is her," Jessica sobbed, clutching her chest. "She attacked my daughter. She said she was going to kill us. Please get her away from us." The taller officer stepped forward, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on me. He saw exactly what Jessica wanted him to see. He saw a calm, dark-skinned woman standing over a group of terrified, crying people. He did not see the owner of a multi-million-dollar penthouse. He saw a threat. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the counter right now," the officer ordered, his voice booming with authority. "Do not make any sudden movements. Put your hands up where I can see them." Evelyn peeked out from behind her hands, a vicious, triumphant gleam in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought the sight of a police badge would finally break my composure and put me back in my place. Marcus stood near the hallway, crossing his arms, looking incredibly satisfied as the officers cornered me. They fully expected me to raise my hands and surrender, to beg for my freedom, to be dragged out of my own home in absolute disgrace. I looked at the officer. I looked at his hand resting on his weapon. I did not raise my hands. I did not step away from the counter. I did not show an ounce of fear. Instead, I slowly lifted my left wrist. I tapped the screen of my smartwatch twice. A soft electronic chime echoed through the penthouse. The heavy security locks on my private elevator disengaged. The polished steel doors at the end of the foyer slid open with a quiet hum. "I will not be raising my hands, officer," I said, my voice cutting through the room with absolute authority. "But you might want to raise your attention to the hallway." 4 people stepped out of the private elevator and walked purposefully into my home. They were totally ready for war. The polished steel doors of my private elevator slid open, and 4 figures stepped directly into the tense atmosphere of my foyer. Leading the group was David, my corporate attorney, wearing a sharp navy suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. They moved with terrifying precision. The taller police officer took his hand off his weapon, clearly thrown off balance by the sudden arrival of a high-powered legal team in a supposedly hostile domestic situation. "Good morning, officers," David said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who billed $1,000 an hour. "I am David Sterling, Chief Legal Counsel for Apex Holdings and personal attorney to Mrs. Kendra Vance. My client is the sole owner of this property. The individuals you are protecting are trespassing, and the woman kneeling on the floor has just committed a felony by filing a false police report." Jessica scrambled to her feet, her fake tears drying up. "He is lying. She threatened us. She assaulted my daughter." David did not even look at her. He unclasped his briefcase, pulled out a sleek tablet, and tapped the screen. He held it up for the 2 police officers to see. "This penthouse is equipped with a cloud-synced security system," David explained, tapping play. "It records high-definition video and clear audio in every common area. Let us review what actually happened here over the last 30 minutes. The officers leaned in to watch. The screen showed crisp, undeniable footage of my kitchen. It showed Brittany throwing her dirty underwear at my face. It showed Marcus screaming at me and threatening to have me thrown out on the street. It showed Evelyn and Jessica using an unauthorized key to barge into my home. It showed the exact moment Jessica pulled out her phone, instructed Evelyn to knock over a bar stool to stage a struggle, and faked her hysterical sobbing for the dispatcher while I stood motionless behind the counter. The officers watched the display of weaponized white tears unfold in high definition. The silence in the kitchen became absolutely suffocating. The taller officer slowly turned his head to look at Jessica. The sympathy he had shown her moments before had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, furious glare. "Ma'am," the officer growled, stepping toward Jessica. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you are in right now? You are facing severe legal consequences for this ridiculous stunt." Jessica backed up against the refrigerator, her pale face turning an ugly shade of red. "No, you do not understand. You have to listen to me. The video is taken out of context. She is a dangerous woman." "There is no context that excuses a false police report," the second officer snapped, pulling a notepad from his belt. "We need everyone's identification right now." Before the officers could begin taking statements, David stepped forward and placed a thick stack of legal documents on the marble kitchen island. "Officers, we will be pressing full charges against these two women for false report and trespassing," David stated firmly. "Furthermore, I am serving notice to the rest of the individuals in this room. Marcus, this is a court-ordered restraining order filed and approved by a judge at 8 o'clock this morning. You are legally required to vacate these premises immediately and maintain a distance of 500 feet from my client. And for Evelyn, Jessica, and Brittany, this is an immediate notice of trespass. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever garbage belongs to you and exit my client's building, or my security team will physically remove you." Evelyn gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. Brittany started crying again, and this time the tears were completely genuine. They were losing their luxury playground. Marcus stared at the restraining order with wild, unfocused eyes. His chest heaved as he realized he was actually being kicked out of the penthouse he had claimed to own just an hour prior. "You think you can just discard me?" Marcus yelled, veins popping in his neck as he lunged forward, only to be blocked by my security contractors. "I am your husband. We are legally married. I know my rights. Kendra, I have a copy of our prenuptial agreement. It clearly states that in the event of a divorce, I am entitled to 50% of all marital assets. You own a massive holding company. I am going to bleed you dry. I want my millions." I looked at Marcus, feeling nothing but absolute pity for his aggressive ignorance. I nodded to David. David offered a tight, predatory smile. He reached into his leather briefcase one more time and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed a stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs directly onto the marble counter. The photographs fanned out for everyone to see. They showed Marcus holding hands with a young blonde woman at an expensive steakhouse. They showed Marcus walking into a boutique hotel with his arm wrapped around her waist. They showed Marcus kissing her passionately in the passenger seat of his car. "You clearly did not read the prenuptial agreement closely enough, Marcus," David said, his voice echoing in the dead-silent kitchen. "Clause 7 subsection B contains a very specific ironclad infidelity provision. In the event of documented marital unfaithfulness, the cheating party forfeits any and all rights to spousal support, asset division, and financial compensation. You are walking away from this marriage with exactly $0.00." Marcus stared at the photographs, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. His entire fake empire, his threats, his arrogance had just been legally incinerated. He had absolutely nothing left. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. And then, breaking the absolute tension of the moment, a sound erupted from the corner of the kitchen. Evelyn suddenly threw her head back and started laughing hysterically out loud. The shrill, grating sound of Evelyn laughing echoed against the marble walls, entirely disrupting the heavy silence of the kitchen. She clutched her stomach, her shoulders shaking as she let out a loud cackle that sounded completely unhinged. The two police officers exchanged a wary glance, their hands tightening near their heavy belts. David, my attorney, narrowed his sharp eyes, but did not move an inch. Marcus just stared at his mother, completely baffled by her sudden outburst of immense joy in the middle of his utter ruin. "You actually think you have won?" Evelyn gasped. Wiping a stray tear of pure amusement from her eye, she straightened her posture, looking at me with a gaze so full of deep malice it could have easily frozen boiling water. "You think kicking my son out and throwing away your marriage makes you the victor here, Kendra? You really believe that your little security cameras and your fancy lawyer have protected your precious corporate empire?" I did not say a single word. I simply watched her waiting for the inevitable confession I knew was coming. Evelyn took a bold step forward, ignoring the police officers entirely. You are so busy worrying about the penthouse and your holding company, you forgot to guard your most personal assets. You are so stupidly arrogant, Kendra. You leave your private mail sitting on the foyer table. You leave your sensitive tax documents in your unlocked home office. You honestly thought because you married my son, you were totally safe from us. Get to the actual point, Evelyn. I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Jessica stepped up right next to her mother-in-law, her previous panic entirely replaced by a venomous, triumphant smile. She confidently crossed her arms, looking at me like I was a rat caught in a steel trap. The point is that you are financially destroyed, Evelyn declared, her loud voice ringing with absolute pride. Last week, while you were busy playing a wealthy executive in your glass tower, I took a little stroll through your private office. I took your social security number. I took your immaculate financial records. I took your pristine, untouched credit history. And I used all of that beautiful privileged data to maliciously apply for a massive corporate business loan. Marcus sharply gasped, taking a quick step back. Mom, what did you just do? I did what I had to do for my real family. Evelyn snapped at him before turning her vicious glare back to me. I took out a $500,000 business loan in your name, Kendra. I forged your digital signature on every single legal document. And because your credit is absolutely flawless, the loan was approved in record time. And the absolute best part, Jessica eagerly chimed in, practically vibrating with intense excitement. The money was already dispersed yesterday afternoon. We wired the entire $500,000 straight into a secure offshore account in my personal name. It is completely untraceable. That money is going to fund Brittany's entire college tuition, a brand new luxury car, and a proper lifestyle for a girl of her high status. You just paid for my daughter's entire future, Kendra. The taller police officer immediately stepped forward, swiftly pulling his heavy radio from his shoulder. Ma'am, you just confessed to massive identity theft and grand larceny in front of two sworn police officers. Evelyn waved her hand at him, rolling her eyes with extreme aggressive prejudice. Oh, please, officer, do not be so incredibly dramatic. I know exactly how the law works. I am her mother-in-law. This is a basic domestic financial dispute between close family members. The police cannot arrest me for a standard civil matter. Kendra has to take me to civil court, and by the time her expensive lawyers even file the basic paperwork, that cash will be washed, hidden, and completely untouchable. She looked back at me, her chest puffing out with absolute, undeniable victory. You see, Kendra, you can kick us out of this apartment, but you will be paying off that $500,000 debt for the rest of your miserable life. Your perfect credit score is utterly ruined. Your company's financial leverage is severely compromised. You will be working until the day you finally die just to pay the massive interest on the money my beautiful blonde granddaughter is currently spending. You lose. Brittany finally stood up from the corner, haughtily dusting off her expensive silk robe. She aggressively wiped her nose and smirked at me, feeling completely invincible behind the thick shield of her grandmother's calculated crime. David, my attorney, looked at me. I could see a faint, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He knew exactly what was about to happen next. I slowly walked over to the kitchen island. I picked up my silver iPad, unlocked the secure screen, and purposefully navigated to a specific, highly secure corporate application. I turned the screen brightness all the way up. Evelyn, you are remarkably confident in your criminal abilities. I said, my voice smooth, cold, and perfectly composed. You are right about one thing. You did find a loan application on my office desk. You did steal my social security number. You did successfully forge my digital signature, and you did successfully secure a $500,000 business loan yesterday afternoon. I walked around the island, stepping directly into Evelyn's personal space. I held the sleek iPad up, forcing her to look directly at the bright, glowing screen. But you made one catastrophic, life-ruining mistake, I continued, holding her panicked gaze. When you stole that specific loan application, you did not bother to research the company you were borrowing the money from. You just saw a financial institution offering fast corporate capital, and you blindly took the bait. Evelyn narrowed her eyes nervously, looking at the bright, glowing corporate logo displayed on my sleek iPad screen. Jessica threw her hands up, sobbing as federal agents secured handcuffs around Evelyn's wrists. It was her idea, Jessica shrieked, pointing at her mother-in-law. I did not know the money was stolen. Evelyn told me it was a legitimate loan. Evelyn glared at Jessica, contorted with betrayal. Before agents could read Evelyn her Miranda rights, the heavy double doors of my penthouse swung open with a loud crash. Richard, Jessica's billionaire father, stormed into the foyer. He was an imposing figure in a bespoke suit flanked by three men, radiating corporate legal menace. Richard marched directly into my kitchen, his shoes clicking against the marble. He took one look at the federal agents, his sobbing daughter, and Marcus cowering in the corner. Then his pale eyes locked onto me. "What is the meaning of this circus?" Richard demanded, his voice booming with the unchecked authority of a Wall Street titan used to the world bowing at his feet. "Your daughter is an accessory to federal wire fraud," I stated calmly. "She and her mother-in-law stole my identity to secure a $500,000 loan from my financial subsidiary. The agents are here to escort them to a holding cell." Richard let out a condescending laugh. He stepped closer, looking me up and down with blatant disgust. He did not see a fellow chief executive officer. He saw a target he believed he could easily crush. "Listen carefully, little girl," Richard sneered. "I know exactly who you are. Marcus told me about his charity case of a wife. You are just a lucky girl from the hood who scraped together a few successful investments. You think because you bought a penthouse and registered an LLC you can play in the big leagues. You are playing a dangerous game with real money, and you are completely out of depth." "I am not playing a game," I replied, holding his gaze. "I am enforcing law. Your daughter and her tuition fund are financed by my stolen assets. That makes them criminals." Richard snapped his fingers. His attorney handed hastily printed injunctions to the lead federal agent. "My daughter and granddaughter are leaving with me right now," Richard declared. "My legal team filed a motion challenging the jurisdictional authority of this arrest. There is zero digital evidence linking Jessica's device to the fraudulent loan application. Evelyn acted alone as the primary applicant. Jessica is an unwitting recipient of familial funds. Until a grand jury convenes and proves criminal intent, you have no legal grounds to detain my daughter." The agent reviewed the paperwork, his jaw tightening. Richard's lawyers had found a temporary, highly expensive technicality to block Jessica's detention. They could take Evelyn, but Jessica and Brittany were shielded by expensive legal maneuvering. Jessica wiped her fake tears, a triumphant smile returning to her face. She grabbed Brittany's hand, moving to stand behind her father's shoulders. Marcus tried to follow them, but Richard held up a hand, stopping his son-in-law. "You handle your own mess, Marcus," Richard growled, looking at him with disappointment. "You are useless to me." Richard turned his attention back to me, dropping his voice to a whisper. "Listen to me, Kendra. I built my wealth on Wall Street while you were playing in the dirt. I have politicians and massive institutional investors on speed dial. If you do not drop these charges against Evelyn and publicly clear my daughter's name by tomorrow morning, I will obliterate your holding company. I will short your stock. I will freeze your credit lines. Your business partners will drop you before lunch. I will crush your company so entirely that you will beg to go back to whatever rundown historical brownstone you crawled out of." "Are you threatening a federal witness, Richard?" I asked, my tone even. "I am making a market prediction," Richard countered, a smirk crossing his face. "You have until tomorrow morning to surrender. Let us go, Jessica." Richard turned on his heel and marched out of the penthouse. Jessica and Brittany followed closely behind, shooting me one last look of arrogant victory. Marcus scrambled out after them, escaping the federal agents who were escorting a handcuffed, weeping Evelyn toward the service elevator. Within 3 minutes, my penthouse was empty again, save for my security team and David. The silence was absolute. The marble floors gleamed under the morning sunlight as if the chaos of the past hour had never happened. David looked at me, raising an eyebrow. "He is highly motivated, Kendra. Richard controls billions in liquid assets. His threats are not empty. He can damage our supply chains and spook our investors if he goes on the offensive tomorrow. How do you want to handle this?" I walked over to my kitchen island and picked up my coffee mug. The coffee was cold now, but I took a sip anyway. I felt a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Richard had made the fatal assumption that my wealth was new, fragile, and easily intimidated. He looked at my skin color and my locks, assuming I lacked the calculating edge required to survive a corporate war. He was about to learn an expensive lesson about underestimating a black woman owning her narrative. I set the mug down and picked up my phone. I dialed a private number that bypassed all standard reception desks. The line rang exactly twice before my lead broker answered. "Good morning, Kendra. What can I do for you?" "Good morning, William," I said, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the skyline. "I need you to pull up the corporate profile for Richard's investment firm. Consolidate our liquid capital across all subsidiary accounts immediately. Prepare the board for an emergency vote in 20 minutes." "Understood," William replied, shifting to complete professional readiness. "What is the strategic objective?" I watched a helicopter pass over the skyscrapers, feeling absolute power coursing through veins. "Initiate the hostile takeover of Richard's firm." The line went dead, but the machinery of my empire immediately roared to life. I did not just leave my penthouse and wander aimlessly. I ordered my driver to take me directly to the fortified underground trading floor of Apex Holdings. This was a room very few people knew existed, a subterranean nerve center bathed in the cool blue glow of massive Bloomberg terminals and real-time global market data. When I walked through the double-glass doors, the usual low hum of quiet conversations abruptly stopped. 40 of my most ruthless, highly compensated quantitative analysts and aggressive day traders turned to look at me. William, my lead broker, was already standing at the central command desk, his sleeves rolled up, projecting Richard's corporate portfolio onto the massive digital wall. "Show me the bleeding edge, William," I commanded, walking up to the main terminal. William tapped his keyboard, pulling up a deeply complex web of Sterling Vista Development's financial obligations. "Richard is highly leveraged, Kendra. He has been borrowing heavily against his own commercial real estate to fund his aggressive expansion into the Gold Coast. His liquidity is a mirage. If his stock drops below $40 a share, it will automatically trigger margin calls from 3 different international banks. He will be forced to liquidate his personal assets to cover the corporate debt." I stared at the glowing numbers, my mind calculating the exact trajectory of Richard's incoming demise. "Then we do not just push his stock down, William, we drop an anvil on it. I want you to initiate a massive coordinated short-selling campaign. Dump 2 million phantom shares of Sterling Vista into the open market over the next 3 hours. Create a synthetic panic. While you do that, instruct our public relations department to anonymously leak the audio file of Marcus confessing to municipal bribery to 3 major financial investigative journalists. I want the whispers of a federal probe circulating on Wall Street before Richard even has time to sit down for his morning coffee. By the time he realizes he is under attack, he will already be drowning." William offered a sharp, predatory grin. "Consider it done, boss. We will bleed him dry." Watching the initial red arrows begin to flicker across Richard's stock ticker gave me a profound sense of clarity. It was only after I saw the first wave of financial destruction successfully deployed that I felt the adrenaline begin to level out. Leaving the underground trading floor, my blood was running dangerously hot, but my mind remained mathematically precise. I needed to ground myself before the market opened. I needed the one place in Chicago that reminded me of exactly who I was and where I came from. I signaled my security driver to pull the SUV around and instructed him to take me straight to Bronzeville. My grandmother's historic brownstone stood proudly in the heart of that culturally rich, vibrant neighborhood. It was not just a piece of prime real estate to me. It was a living monument to my family's survival, purchased with literal bags of cash by a hardworking black woman during an era when downtown banks refused to even look at her loan applications. To Evelyn and Jessica, the brownstone was just an old, outdated brick house in a zip code they actively despised. To me, it was the absolute unshakable foundation of my entire financial empire. I planned to sit in my grandmother's preserved parlor, drink a cold glass of sweet tea, and map out the exact sequence of Richard's corporate execution. But as my driver turned the heavy vehicle onto the familiar tree-lined street, a thick cloud of gray dust plumed high into the morning air. The harsh mechanical grinding of heavy diesel machinery violently shattered the neighborhood's usual quiet. My heart slammed aggressively against my ribs. I threw open the car door before the vehicle even came to a complete stop, my heels hitting the pavement hard. Two massive, bright yellow bulldozers were parked directly on the pristine cobblestone sidewalk, their engines roaring like hungry beasts. A crew of 6 burly contractors wearing hard hats and safety vests were actively swinging heavy steel sledgehammers into the original hand-carved mahogany columns of my front porch. Beautiful century-old wood splintered and crashed violently to the ground, kicking up clouds of ancient dust. They were literally destroying my legacy right in front of my eyes. "Stop what you are doing right now!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, sprinting recklessly across the manicured lawn and throwing my physical body directly between the swinging steel hammers and the beautifully stained glass front door. "Turn off those machines immediately. You are trespassing on private property." The workers paused, their swinging, exchanging confused glances with one another. The roaring diesel engines of the bulldozers idled down to a low, rumbling growl. A heavy-set foreman wearing an orange visibility vest marched aggressively over to me, holding a thick aluminum clipboard tightly. "Lady, you need to step back behind the yellow safety perimeter right now," the foreman barked, waving his hand dismissively toward the street. "We have a municipal demolition permit approved by the city, and we have a strict timeline today. This historical block is being cleared out for a luxury commercial development project. You cannot stand here and block a legal construction zone." "You are not clearing anything on this lot," I fired back, standing my ground firmly on the ruined, dusty steps of my heritage. "I am Kendra Vance. I am the sole legal owner of this historic property. You do not have my authorization to touch a single brick of this brownstone. Call your men off." The foreman let out a heavy, irritated sigh. He flipped open his clipboard and pulled out a stack of legally stamped papers. "I do not know what kind of scam you are trying to pull here, ma'am, but you do not own this property anymore. We work directly for Sterling Vista Developments. The Chief Executive Officer, Richard Sterling, purchased this lot free and clear yesterday morning. We have the expedited demolition orders signed." Richard, the billionaire, had moved significantly faster than I had anticipated. But the foreman's words made zero logical sense. The ancestral brownstone was firmly locked inside my holding company's isolated asset portfolio. Marcus had absolutely no legal authority or executive power to sell it, and Richard could not simply buy a commercial property without the primary owner's notarized signature. "Show me the transfer deed," I demanded fiercely, snatching the heavy clipboard right out of his rough hands before he could even react. I flipped frantically past the municipal permits and stopped dead at the property transfer agreement. My eyes scanned the black ink, trying desperately to process the impossible legal nightmare staring back at me. The document showed a complete transfer of the brownstone from my holding company to Richard's commercial development firm for a fraction of its actual market value. The authorized seller listed on the legal document was Marcus Vance. I looked closely at the execution date. The transfer had been backdated to 3.5 years ago, exactly 2 days before Marcus and I signed our ironclad prenuptial agreement. He had forged a fraudulent sale to Richard before his legal rights to my assets were stripped away, keeping the fake paperwork hidden in the dark until Richard needed an emergency weapon. "This is a blatantly forged document," I said, my voice trembling with raw rage as I shoved the clipboard back at him. "Marcus did not have the executive authority to sell this home. This deed is completely invalid without a certified corporate notary." "It looks pretty certified to me, lady," the foreman sneered, tapping the bottom corner of the heavy paper. "Now step aside before I call the cops and have you removed for obstructing a legal work site." I looked down at the bottom of the page. The foreman was completely right. There was a bright blue official notary seal stamped perfectly over Marcus's forged signature, legally validating the fraudulent transfer. But it was not the forgery that made my blood run cold. It was the specific name boldly printed on the official notary stamp. It belonged to my own chief financial officer. The most trusted executive inside my company had sold me out. The name stamped in blue ink was Thomas Caldwell. He was the chief financial officer of Apex Holdings, a man I personally handpicked and elevated to the highest executive floor of my empire. He knew every password, every blind spot, and every single asset my company controlled. My mind went entirely blank for a fraction of a second, and then a wave of cold, calculating clarity washed over me. Marcus and Richard had not just tried to steal my property, they had infiltrated my corporate sanctuary. I shoved the heavy clipboard directly back into the foreman's chest. I told him that if one more sledgehammer swung toward my grandmother's porch, I would personally see to it that his construction license was permanently revoked across the entire state of Illinois. I instructed my security driver to block the bulldozers with my armored vehicle, pulling the keys from the ignition and tossing them into the thick bushes. I dialed David as I marched to the street, my voice devoid of panic. I ordered a total lockdown of the executive floor at Apex Holdings. I told David to freeze all internal servers, suspend all executive keycards, and dispatch our elite forensic accounting team to my private conference room. By the time I arrived at my glass tower in downtown Chicago, the building operated under absolute martial law. I bypassed my usual greetings and marched straight into the glass-walled conference room. 4 forensic digital analysts were already typing furiously on their secured laptops. I gave them one simple directive. I wanted every single digital footprint, encrypted email, and offshore financial transfer associated with Thomas Caldwell extracted and projected onto the main screen within the hour. The betrayal was far deeper than a single forged real estate document. As the analysts ripped through his hidden files, the ugly truth painted a terrifying picture. Thomas had been feeding Richard Sterling highly classified financial data for the past 4 months. Richard had identified Thomas as my weak link, discovering a massive undisclosed gambling debt that my trusted executive had desperately tried to hide. Richard had paid off the debt and padded an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. In exchange, Thomas had provided Richard with a comprehensive map of my company's leveraging points, and he had used his corporate notary power to backdate the fraudulent transfer of my ancestral brownstone to Marcus. They thought they had me completely surrounded. They thought my internal structure was rotting from the inside out. But they severely underestimated how ruthlessly I could pivot when threatened. I walked down the quiet, locked-down hallway and opened the heavy oak door to the corner office. Thomas was sitting behind his mahogany desk, casually sipping sparkling water, completely unaware that his entire life had just been legally incinerated. When he saw my face, his confident posture immediately stiffened. He noticed the 2 silent security contractors stepping into the room right behind me. I closed the door until the lock clicked shut. I did not yell. I did not throw things. I walked slowly over to his desk and dropped a thick, heavy manila folder directly onto his pristine leather blotter. Thomas opened the folder. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He stared at the printed offshore bank statements, the decrypted emails between him and Richard, and the high-definition photograph of his forged notary stamp on my grandmother's deed. His hands began to visibly shake. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute suffocating terror. "Kendra, please," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking as he stumbled backward in his expensive ergonomic chair. "Richard forced me into this. He found out about my debts. He threatened to ruin my entire career if I did not cooperate. I had no other choice. I am so incredibly sorry. I will resign immediately. I will pack my things right now." "You are not resigning, Thomas," I said, leaning over his desk, planting both hands flat on the polished wood. "If you resign, I will hand this folder directly to the federal authorities. You will be indicted for corporate espionage, grand larceny, and federal wire fraud. You will spend the next 20 years in a maximum security federal prison, and your family will be completely bankrupted by the legal fees." Thomas began to hyperventilate. He clutched his chest, hot tears of genuine panic welling in his eyes. He knew I was not bluffing. He knew I had the exact resources to bury him so deeply he would never see daylight again. "What do you want me to do?" Thomas choked out, begging for any possible lifeline. "I will do anything you want, Kendra. Just please do not send me to prison." I stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of my tailored blazer. Firing him would have been the standard, predictable corporate response. Sending him to jail would have been satisfying. But utilizing him as a weapon against the billionaire who tried to destroy my heritage, that was a masterstroke. "Richard has a massive shareholder meeting scheduled for next week. I stated smoothly, outlining the trap I was currently building. He is heavily relying on the insider financial vulnerabilities you have been feeding him to assure his board that he can absorb my holding company. You are going to continue your relationship with him, Thomas. You are going to feed him extremely specific, highly toxic financial data that I will personally provide to you. Thomas swallowed hard, nodding frantically as he absorbed my command. You are going to convince Richard to over-leverage his primary commercial assets to prepare for a hostile takeover. I continued, a cold smile forming on my lips. You are going to make him feel completely invincible. You are going to lead him directly into a financial minefield that will trigger a catastrophic margin call. If you execute this perfectly, I will let you walk away with your freedom. If you fail, you belong to the federal government. Thomas stared at me, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to process the sheer complexity of the trap I was forcing him to build. What kind of data do you want me to feed him? He stammered, wiping a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead. Richard is paranoid. He has his own team of auditors. If I give him something completely fabricated, he will catch it. You are not going to give him fake data, Thomas, I replied, walking behind his desk and resting my hands on the back of his expensive leather chair. You are going to give him real data, but it will be data I have weaponized. You are going to send Richard the highly classified acquisition files for a company called Horizon Logistics. Thomas's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. Horizon, Kendra, that is a ghost company. It is a toxic asset bundle completely loaded with uncollectible subprime commercial debt. Apex Holdings has been trying to quietly write off that catastrophic loss for 2 years. Exactly, I whispered, leaning down so my voice was right next to his ear. But Richard does not know that. You are going to alter the internal projections just enough to make Horizon Logistics look like a heavily undervalued gold mine. You will convince Richard that I am desperately trying to keep Horizon hidden because it holds the key to monopolizing the Midwest supply chain. You will tell him that if he buys Horizon's debt through his shadow equity firms, he will essentially hold a knife to the throat of my entire holding company. Thomas swallowed hard, finally realizing the absolute brilliance of the trap. He will bypass his own auditors because he will think he is stealing your most valuable secret. He will buy the toxic debt. And the moment he signs the purchase agreement, I finished for him, he will absorb $400 million in immediate unpayable liabilities. The debt covenants will trigger instantly. He will bankrupt himself trying to destroy me, and he will thank you for handing him the weapon. You have 48 hours to make him take the bait. Do not disappoint me, Thomas. My lawyers have the FBI on speed dial. I left Thomas trembling in his office, his fate sealed by his immense greed. The trap was perfectly set, but Richard Sterling was not a man who waited for enemies to strike first. By the time I woke up the following morning, my name was plastered across every major financial news network and gossip blog. Richard and Jessica launched a meticulously coordinated, vicious media smear campaign overnight. They did not just attack my business acumen. They attacked my character, my marriage, and my very identity. I turned on the television in my living room watching as Jessica sat on a popular morning talk show couch. She was dressed in a soft, conservative pastel cardigan, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while playing the ultimate victim. Marcus sat right beside her, looking like a defeated, exhausted man who had just survived a war. We took her in, Marcus lied smoothly to the sympathetic host, shaking his head. I gave Kendra a beautiful life, but she was hiding assets, manipulating my family, and trying to steal my generational wealth. She is a deeply angry, unstable woman who resents my family's success. Jessica chimed in, her voice quivering perfectly on cue. She physically attacked my teenage daughter, locked us out of the apartment, and is now trying to ruin my father's legitimate business out of pure spite. We are terrified of her. It was a textbook character assassination. They weaponized the angry black woman trope with surgical precision, painting me as a fraudulent, gold-digging ex-wife, trying to steal from her wealthy, benevolent husband. Richard's public relations team pushed the false narrative to every major financial outlet, implying that Apex Holdings was built entirely on stolen marital funds. Within 2 hours, the damage to my corporate reputation was catastrophic. My phone began ringing incessantly. The stock price of my holding company started experiencing sharp, terrifying drops as retail investors panicked over the scandalous headlines. By noon, my executive board of directors demanded an emergency mandatory meeting in the main glass conference room of my downtown headquarters. I walked into the boardroom wearing a tailored crimson suit projecting absolute calm. The 12 board members, mostly older men, who had always been slightly intimidated by my rapid rise to power, looked at me with undisguised panic. Kendra, this is an absolute public relations disaster, the lead board member Harrison stated, pacing back and forth across the room. Our institutional investors are calling constantly. Richard Sterling is a titan in this industry, and he is publicly accusing you of corporate fraud and asset theft. The media is eating up this domestic drama, and it is actively tanking our quarterly valuations. The allegations are entirely fabricated, I replied, taking my seat at the head of the heavy oak table. Marcus has no legal claim to my assets. He triggered the infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement. Richard is simply throwing a tantrum because I caught his daughter committing federal wire fraud. The market does not care about the truth, Kendra, another board member shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The market cares about stability. Richard has frozen 2 of our critical supply chain contracts. 3 of our biggest venture capital partners are threatening to pull their funding by the end of the week if this scandal is not immediately resolved. We are bleeding capital every single hour. Harrison stopped pacing and looked directly at me. He delivered the ultimatum I knew was coming. You have become a massive liability to this company, Kendra, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a cold quote. You have until tomorrow morning to fix this public relations nightmare and stabilize the stock. If you cannot stop Richard's media assault, we will force a vote of no confidence. You will step down as chief executive officer, or we will publicly oust you to save the company. They were giving me 24 hours to surrender or lose the empire I had built from the ground up. The room was suffocatingly tense. They expected me to argue, to fight, to beg for my position. I slowly looked around the table, making brief, intense eye contact with each board member. You want stability? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. You want the media circus to end? Fine. I will give you exactly what you want. I stood up, smoothing the front of my crimson jacket. Call Richard's legal team. Tell them I am ready to negotiate a complete surrender. Arrange a joint public press conference for tomorrow morning at his corporate headquarters. Tell him I will publicly apologize, step down as CEO, and sign over the disputed marital assets to Marcus to avoid a prolonged legal battle. Harrison blinked, completely shocked by my sudden capitulation. You are just going to surrender your assets. I am going to do what is best for the survival of this company, I lied flawlessly. The news of my impending public surrender leaked to the press within the hour. Richard and Jessica were absolutely thrilled. They thought they had successfully broken me. They believed their coordinated media attack and board pressure had forced me to my knees. The following morning, I arrived at Sterling Vista Developments, Richard's massive corporate headquarters. The grand lobby was packed with reporters, financial journalists, and flashing cameras. Richard, Jessica, and Marcus stood proudly at a raised podium, practically glowing with arrogant victory. They had printed out a massive stack of transfer documents ready for my signature on live television. They expected me to walk up to those microphones, hang my head in shame, and hand over my wealth to save my reputation. I walked toward the podium, the television cameras flashing wildly in my very own face. I looked at Richard's smug, victorious smile. I calmly looked at Marcus, holding a pen ready to take my hard-earned money. They thought this press conference was my execution. They had absolutely no idea it was theirs. The atrium of Sterling Vista Developments was packed with aggressive journalists, financial analysts, and television crews from every major network. The air hummed with the buzz of a massive corporate scandal reaching its climax. Richard stepped up to the polished mahogany podium, first adjusting his silk tie. He leaned into the microphone, projecting the perfectly crafted image of a benevolent patriarch handling an unfortunate family matter. Thank you all for being here, Richard announced, his deep voice echoing impressively. The past 48 hours have been incredibly challenging for my family. We have been the target of baseless maneuvers by a very troubled, angry individual. However, I believe in the power of forgiveness. Kendra Vance has agreed to take full accountability for her erratic actions, publicly apologize to my daughter Jessica, and formally relinquish the assets she unlawfully withheld from her husband. Marcus stepped up beside him, looking down at his shoes to feign deep exhaustion. He wore a tailored gray suit, playing the abused spouse to absolute perfection. "I just want to put this nightmare behind us," Marcus told the crowd, his voice shaking with manufactured grief. "I tried to give Kendra a beautiful life, but her bitter jealousy and greed completely poisoned our marriage. I am relieved she is finally doing the right thing today." A low murmur rippled through the expansive press pool. The cameras instantly pivoted toward me as I walked up the carpeted steps to the brightly lit stage. I wore my sharply tailored crimson suit, walking with a slow, deliberate grace. I did not look defeated. I did not look like a broken woman coming to beg for public mercy. Richard offered me a condescending, tight-lipped smile as I approached the heavy wooden podium. He tapped a silver fountain pen against a thick stack of legal transfer documents. "Just sign on the dotted line, little girl," Richard whispered viciously under his breath, leaning in so the microphones would not pick up his true voice. "Sign the papers, read the pathetic apology script my team prepared, and I will let you walk out of my building with your dignity intact." I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the neatly typed apology script sitting right next to the microphone. Then I looked directly out into the blinding sea of flashing cameras and hungry journalists. "Good morning," I said, my voice ringing out clear, sharp, and totally unwavering. "My name is Kendra Vance, Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings. I was invited here today to issue a formal apology to Richard Sterling and Marcus Vance. But after thoroughly reviewing the specific terms of my forced surrender, I decided to bring something else instead." Richard furrowed his brow, stepping slightly forward. Kendra just read the prepared statement. I ignored him entirely. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out an encrypted digital audio recorder. I placed it directly next to the primary podium microphone. I looked at David, my attorney, who was standing by the media soundboard. He gave me a sharp nod and plugged a wireless audio receiver into the main broadcast feed. "Instead of a fake apology, I would like to offer the press a brief educational seminar on how Sterling Vista Developments actually acquires its historic urban properties," I announced confidently. I pressed play on my device. Instantly, the crisp, undeniable audio of Richard and Marcus conversing in a private setting blasted through the massive speakers. "Those historic brownstones in Bronzeville are sitting on an absolute goldmine." Richard's recorded voice boomed, sounding arrogant and entirely ruthless. "But these stubborn black families refuse to sell. They keep holding on to their heritage nonsense. I need those city zoning officials paid off by Friday, Marcus. We are going to rezone that entire residential block as a commercial hazard zone, force the property taxes to quadruple overnight, and choke them out. They will be begging us to buy their homes for pennies on the dollar within 6 months." The entire press pool gasped collectively. Camera shutters began firing like automatic weapons. "I already transferred the heavy bribe money through the offshore accounts, Richard," Marcus's recorded voice eagerly replied. "Thomas Caldwell stamped the fake deeds yesterday morning. We can bulldoze Kendra's grandmother's property first to set an example. She is too stupid to realize we legally stole it right out from under her." "Good," the recorded. Richard laughed cruelly. "Let her cry about it. We will pave over their history and build luxury condos for people who actually matter." Absolute explosive chaos erupted in the grand atrium. Dozens of reporters started screaming questions all at once. The financial analysts frantically pulled out their phones, aggressively typing urgent messages to their trading desks. "Turn that off!" Richard roared, his face turning a violent shade of purple. He lunged wildly across the podium, frantically grabbing at my digital recorder. "Cut the microphone! Cut the audio feed right now! Security, get her off this stage!" Marcus stood completely paralyzed, his jaw dropping open in sheer terror as his own recorded voice confessed to massive real estate fraud and bribery on live national television. I effortlessly snatched my recorder off the podium and stepped back, easily evading Richard's grasp. I grabbed the microphone with my left hand, raising my steady voice to cut through the noise. "You demanded a public spectacle, Richard, and now you have one," I shouted over the uproar, ensuring every camera captured my words. That audio file has just been distributed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and every news outlet here. You tried to steal my wealth and destroy my community, but you only managed to destroy yourself. My private security immediately intercepted Richard's guards. I will ruin your company before the market closes, Richard screamed. You cannot tank anything, I fired back with absolute dominance. Your stock is in a catastrophic freefall. I just submitted a bid to buy your plunging company at pennies on the dollar. The sheer magnitude of my declaration hit Richard like a physical blow. The arrogant billionaire who had just threatened to wipe my existence from the corporate map stumbled backward. The flashing cameras captured every second of his rapid descent into panic. He looked at the digital stock ticker scrolling across the monitors in his atrium. The downward arrows confirmed his worst nightmare. His company valuation was hemorrhaging millions of dollars by the second. Get me to the car now! Richard shrieked at his security detail, shoving his way past the podium. He did not wait for Jessica or Marcus. He sprinted through the rabid journalists, pushing microphones out of his face as he bolted for his armored SUV. I stood tall at the podium, watching the so-called Titan of Wall Street flee his headquarters in complete disgrace. David stepped beside me, packing his briefcase with a satisfied nod. The trap had snapped shut flawlessly. We walked out the side exit, escorted by my private security, leaving the chaos behind us. Meanwhile, the fallout was hitting Marcus and Jessica with devastating speed. Left stranded on the stage, they were instantly surrounded by screaming reporters, demanding answers about the bribery and wire fraud allegations. Marcus panicked and pushed his way into a nearby glass conference room, dragging Jessica inside and slamming the heavy door shut to block out the media. The moment they were alone, the fragile alliance between them violently shattered. "This is entirely your fault!" Jessica screamed, throwing her handbag directly at Marcus. "You brought that calculating, vindictive woman into our family. You told us she was just a submissive girl from the hood. You said her company was an easy target." Marcus swatted the bag away, his face twisting with rage and fear. "Do not try to pin this on me, Jessica. You and my mother are the ones who committed federal identity theft. You got greedy. If you had just let me handle the divorce quietly, I could have squeezed her for millions in alimony. Instead, you forced my hand, and now the Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently freezing every bank account tied to my name." Jessica pulled out her phone with trembling hands. She desperately tried to log into her offshore accounts to transfer the stolen $500,000. The screen flashed a bright red error message. The funds had been legally frozen by federal authorities. She let out a guttural scream of absolute despair. Her phone suddenly rang. It was Brittany. Jessica answered, putting the call on speakerphone so Marcus could hear the destruction unfolding in real time. "Mom, what is happening?" Brittany cried hysterically through the phone. "I just tried to pay my tuition deposit at the university registrar, and my black card was declined. The bursar told me my entire account has been flagged for fraud. I am being administratively withdrawn from classes. I have nowhere to stay, and my car was just towed from the parking garage." "Everything is going to be fine, sweetie," Jessica lied, hyperventilating as she looked at Marcus. "Your grandfather is fixing it right now. Just stay at a hotel tonight." "I cannot pay for a hotel," Brittany wailed. "Every single credit card is frozen." "Mom, I am sitting on the sidewalk with my luggage. What am I supposed to do?" Jessica hung up the phone and sank to the conference room floor, burying her face in her hands. The luxurious, untouchable lifestyle they had built on the backs of stolen assets and racial superiority had officially evaporated in less than 48 hours. They were completely broke, entirely exposed, and facing decades in federal prison. Across the city, Richard was fighting a losing battle inside his executive office. He paced frantically behind his massive desk, screaming into his phone at his wealth managers. His company's stock had dropped 40% since the press conference. Institutional investors were dumping their shares at terrifying speeds to avoid the taint of federal bribery charges. If he did not secure a massive influx of liquid capital before the closing bell, my hostile takeover bid would automatically trigger, allowing me to absorb his entire empire for absolute pennies. "Call the international banks," Richard barked at his panicked chief financial officer. "Liquidate the commercial real estate portfolios in Manhattan. I need $200 million in emergency capital right now to block her acquisition. Do whatever it takes. Nobody is picking up the phone, Richard, his executive pleaded, staring at the plunging financial charts. The Securities and Exchange Commission just announced a formal probe into our zoning practices. You are completely toxic. Our regular lenders are actively ignoring our calls. Richard slammed his fists onto his desk, his breathing heavy and erratic. He was a cornered animal. He dialed his most aggressive shadow market private equity contacts. These were the ruthless, predatory lenders of last resort who charged exorbitant interest rates and demanded absolute collateral. He begged for a massive bridge loan to save his sinking ship. After 3 agonizing hours of desperate negotiation, a private equity firm finally agreed to the terms. They would provide the exact capital needed to artificially inflate his stock and block my hostile takeover. But they required Richard to put up his personal estate's corporate headquarters and every remaining liquid asset as absolute unconditional collateral. He had zero room to negotiate. "Send the paperwork immediately," Richard ordered, wiping cold sweat from his brow. "I will sign anything to crush that woman." 10 minutes later, the encrypted loan approval documents arrived in his secure inbox. Richard let out a massive sigh of relief. He had survived. He quickly scrolled to the bottom to sign. His hand froze midair. He stared at the official corporate seal stamped below. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, refusing to believe the terrifying reality printed in stark black ink. The emergency lending institution that had just acquired the absolute collateral rights to his entire life was a subsidiary of Apex Holdings. Richard stared at the glowing screen, his lungs forgetting how to process oxygen. I had not just blocked his recovery. I had engineered his total financial annihilation. The ink on his digital signature was barely dry before my legal team initiated the immediate margin call. The terms of his predatory loan were explicitly tied to his plummeting company stock valuation. Because his shares were in a catastrophic freefall, the emergency loan went into automatic default the very second it was officially issued. He had absolutely zero liquid capital to cover the massive margin. He was now legally and irrevocably bankrupt, entirely destroyed by his own absolute arrogance. I sat comfortably in my downtown corner office, sipping a fresh espresso as David walked in with the final confirmation documents. I gave him a single satisfied nod. The aggressive foreclosure protocols were executed with terrifying speed. Within 2 hours, a massive fleet of armored security vehicles arrived at the Sterling Vista corporate headquarters. Richard was physically escorted out of his own building by my private contractors. He was screaming at his lawyers, demanding they fix the situation, but there was absolutely nothing left to fix. He was not allowed to take his computer, his private files, or even his gold-plated nameplate from his heavy mahogany desk. The massive empire he had spent 4 decades building through systematic bribery, racial exploitation, and ruthless intimidation was now completely owned by the very woman he had called a lucky girl from the hood. The hostile corporate takeover was only the first wave of my absolute justice. Richard had arrogantly pledged every single one of his personal residential estates as unconditional collateral to secure that disastrous loan. That included the sprawling $30 million suburban compound where Jessica and Brittany were currently hiding. Jessica pulled her leased luxury SUV up to the towering wrought iron gates of her childhood home, fully expecting to find a safe sanctuary. Instead, she found a heavy steel padlock and 4 of my armed security guards blocking the pristine driveway. Her designer luggage was sitting in a disorganized pile on the grass near the curb. Brittany jumped out of the car, screaming frantically at the unmoving guards, demanding they open the gates for the rightful owners. The lead security guard did not argue. He just calmly handed Jessica a laminated legal notice of immediate foreclosure. Jessica dialed her father frantically, screaming into her phone, demanding to know why she was suddenly locked out of her own house. Richard did not answer her desperate calls. He was already sitting alone in a cheap, dark motel near the international airport, desperately trying to figure out how to avoid federal prison. Marcus was nowhere to be found. He had completely abandoned his wife and niece the exact moment his own personal bank accounts were permanently frozen by the authorities. Jessica stood on the public sidewalk, looking at her weeping, hysterical daughter and her expensive bags sitting outside. The brutal, unavoidable reality of her sudden and utter poverty crashed heavily down on her fragile shoulders like a massive, suffocating avalanche. She had absolutely no cash, zero available credit, and absolutely no powerful allies left to protect her from the fallout. The wealthy friends she had carefully cultivated at her exclusive suburban country clubs were currently ignoring her desperate phone calls, entirely terrified of being publicly associated with a massive federal fraud scandal. Sitting on the curb outside her locked mansion, Jessica desperately scrolled through her gold-plated iPhone. She dialed Victoria Harrington, the powerful chairwoman of the Gold Coast Charity Gala, and her supposedly closest confidant. They had spent 3 years drinking expensive mimosas and gossiping about the new money families. The phone rang 5 times before Victoria finally answered. "Victoria, thank God," Jessica gasped, trying to maintain her aristocratic composure. "I need a huge favor. There has been a massive misunderstanding with my father's accounts. Can Brittany and I stay at your guest house for a few days until my lawyers clear this up?" The line was dead silent for a moment. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice was completely devoid of its usual syrupy warmth. It was pure freezing ice. "Jessica, you really should not be calling this number. My husband's firm does a lot of business with federal contractors. We cannot have the FBI tracking calls to our residence." "Victoria, please, we are locked out. We have nowhere to go," Jessica pleaded, her voice cracking. "I saw the press conference, Jessica. Everyone at the country club saw it," Victoria replied, her tone dripping with thinly veiled disgust. "By the way, the board held an emergency meeting an hour ago. We are formally auditing the charity accounts you managed, just to be absolutely certain none of our funds were mixed with your family's fraudulent offshore capital. Your membership has been permanently revoked. Do not contact me again." The line clicked dead. Jessica stared at her phone, her chest tight with panic. The hypocrisy was nauseating. Just last week, Victoria was happily drinking Richard's imported champagne, and now she was treating Jessica like a radioactive disease. Desperation took over. Jessica dug into the bottom of her designer purse and found a crisp $50 bill, the absolute last piece of physical cash she possessed. She frantically flagged down a passing taxi, shoving her crying daughter into the back seat. She directed the driver to the Waldorf Astoria, a luxury hotel where she had held elite VIP status for over a decade. She prayed that a hidden platinum reserve card she kept tucked in her passport holder would bypass the federal freeze. They dragged their heavy bags into the opulent chandelier-lit lobby. Jessica marched up to the marble front desk, trying to project the intimidating aura of a billionaire's daughter, despite her ruined makeup and shaking hands. The head concierge, a man who usually greeted her by name and immediately offered complimentary champagne, looked at her with a highly uncomfortable, stiff expression. "I need the presidential suite for 3 nights. Put it on this card," Jessica demanded, sliding the platinum plastic across the marble. The concierge didn't even pick up the card. He looked around nervously as whispers began to erupt among the wealthy patrons in the lobby. People were pointing at Jessica, recognizing her from the viral humiliation at the press conference. "I am sorry, Mrs. Sterling," the concierge said, his voice quiet but incredibly firm. "Your corporate accounts have been flagged by the federal government. We have strict instructions not to process any transactions associated with your name." "Do you know who my father is?" Jessica shrieked, slamming her hand against the desk, her manicured facade completely shattering. "Run the card. I demand you run the card right now." "Yes, ma'am. We all know exactly who your father is. We saw the news," the concierge replied, his polite tone now laced with absolute finality. "And that is exactly why we cannot accommodate you. You are causing a disturbance. I must ask you to leave the premises immediately, or I will have security escort you out." 2 large hotel security guards in dark suits stepped forward, crossing their arms. The humiliation was visceral. The elite society she had worshipped, the very same system of privilege she had used to mock my background, and my locks was violently chewing her up and spitting her out onto the street. She was violently escorted out of the rotating glass doors, stumbling back onto the hot concrete pavement in complete disgrace. Brittany violently threw herself onto her large Louis Vuitton suitcase, sobbing uncontrollably about her ruined life. She loudly wailed about her cancelled college enrollment and her missing luxury sports car. Jessica looked at the spoiled daughter she had weaponized against me just a few days prior. She realized that Marcus had dragged them into this unwinnable war, and Evelyn had orchestrated the fake business loan that was about to send them all directly to a federal penitentiary. The arrogant colorist hierarchy they had relied on to protect them from accountability was completely shattered into a million pieces. Jessica knew that blind family loyalty was a luxury she could no longer afford. If she took the fall for Evelyn's massive wire fraud, Brittany would end up completely homeless, trapped in a broken system she used to mock, and totally destitute. A cold, calculating survival instinct took over Jessica's panicked mind. He grabbed Brittany roughly by the arm, hailed another cab with her last few dollars, and sped away from the luxury district. She did not try to find another hotel to hide. She directed the driver straight downtown, pulling up in front of the towering glass and steel architecture of the federal courthouse building. Jessica marched purposefully through the heavy security doors, demanding to speak directly with the lead federal prosecutor, handling the Apex Holdings wire fraud investigation. 10 minutes later, she sat nervously in a sterile, brightly lit interrogation room, staring across a metal table at two sharp-suited federal agents. She took a deep, trembling breath, totally ready to burn her entire new family to the ground to save herself. She looked the lead agent directly in the eye and eagerly offered to testify against Marcus and Evelyn, promising to provide every single detail of their corporate embezzlement, their shady financial dealings, and their identity theft, in exchange for absolute unconditional legal immunity. She knew she was abandoning her father in his darkest hour, leaving him to face the total ruin of his massive, corrupt empire entirely alone. She did not care. The fierce loyalty she had sworn to Marcus and Evelyn had evaporated the moment her platinum credit cards stopped functioning. She was determined to survive at any cost. The agent slid a silver digital recorder across the table. They pressed the small red button, the red light glowing brightly in the sterile room. Jessica leaned forward, clearing her throat, and prepared to deliver the absolute final blow that would send her manipulative husband and her cruel colorist mother-in-law to a maximum security federal prison for the rest of their miserable lives. Jessica leaned into the digital recorder, her perfectly manicured hands trembling just slightly against the cold metal table. The two federal agents sat across from her, their expressions entirely unreadable. She did not hesitate. For the next 2 hours, she systematically dismantled the entire criminal operation her in-laws had built. She detailed exactly how Evelyn had stolen my social security number, explaining that the older woman had bragged about accessing my private office to secure the fraudulent loan. She handed over the specific offshore account numbers, the routing data, and the encrypted passwords she had desperately saved on her phone. But she did not stop there. To guarantee her own absolute immunity, Jessica handed them Marcus on a silver platter. She revealed that his sudden firing from the bank was not just a minor misunderstanding, as he had proudly claimed to his mother. Jessica had secretly seen his hidden digital ledgers. She explicitly mapped out how Marcus had embezzled millions from his banking clients over 3 years, funneling the stolen capital into untraceable shell companies to fund his lavish lifestyle and his desperate attempts to impress her billionaire father. Jessica made sure to emphasize that she was merely a victim of their toxic, manipulative household. She sang like a terrified canary, enthusiastically burning her husband and mother-in-law to ash to save her own skin. Across the city, Marcus was sitting in a dingy, dimly lit bar, desperately downing his third glass of cheap whiskey. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a panicked text message from a former colleague still working at the bank. The message warned him that federal investigators had just raided the corporate archives and seized his old hard drives. A second text arrived from a friend at the courthouse. It said Jessica had just been seen walking into the federal prosecutor's office with a team of agents. The blood completely drained from Marcus's face. He instantly realized his white privileged sister-in-law was throwing him directly under the bus to secure a plea deal. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He cursed loudly, slamming his fist against the sticky wooden bar top. He knew he had to move fast. He had absolutely zero time left. His bank accounts were already frozen, and his credit cards were completely useless. He needed untraceable physical cash to disappear, and he knew exactly where to find it. He sprinted out of the bar, leaving his unpaid tab behind, and aggressively hailed a cab to his mother's suburban townhome. He knew Evelyn always kept a secret emergency reserve of cash hidden in a floor safe beneath her master bedroom closet. Marcus kicked open the front door of Evelyn's house, completely ignoring his mother's startled scream from the living room. He bounded up the carpeted stairs, taking them two at a time. Evelyn scrambled after him, demanding to know what he was doing. Marcus did not answer her. He tore into her master closet, throwing her expensive designer shoes and silk dresses violently out of the way. He ripped the carpet back, exposing the heavy steel dial of her hidden floor safe. I knew the combination by heart. He quickly spun the dial, yanked the heavy door open, and started grabbing thick banded stacks of $100 bills. The heavy metal door swung open with a loud creak. He did not care about the mess he was making. He stuffed over $80,000 in loose cash into a duffel bag. Evelyn stood in the doorway, shrieking at him to stop stealing her last remaining lifeline. Marcus roughly shoved past his own mother, knocking her against the doorframe. He coldly told her that Jessica had flipped on them and the federal authorities were coming for her. He left Evelyn crying on the floor of her ruined closet and sprinted out the front door, desperate to buy a one-way international ticket out of the country. Marcus directed his cab driver to speed straight to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. He nervously clutched the heavy duffel bag to his chest, constantly looking out the rear window to see if police cruisers were tailing him. He planned to buy a cash ticket to a non-extradition country, change his identity, and disappear forever. He sprinted through the automatic sliding doors of the international terminal, his expensive dress shirt completely soaked in terrified sweat. He bypassed the main ticketing counters and headed straight for the automated kiosks, purchasing a wildly expensive last-minute first-class seat to Dubai. With his boarding pass in hand, he aggressively pushed his way to the front of the security screening line. He threw his bag onto the conveyor belt and practically ran through the metal detector. He grabbed his bag on the other side and sprinted toward his departure gate. He looked over his shoulder one last time. The digital clock on the wall showed his flight was boarding in exactly 10 minutes. He could practically taste his freedom. He handed his passport to the gate agent, breathing heavily, entirely convinced he had successfully outsmarted the law, his family, and me. The gate agent scanned the dark blue booklet. Instead of a green approval light, the computer screen flashed a bright, blinding red. A loud, sharp alarm tone echoed loudly from the podium scanner. The agent immediately stepped back from the desk. Before Marcus could even process the sudden rejection, 4 heavily armed United States Marshals stepped out from behind the boarding ramp, their hands resting firmly on their weapons. They completely surrounded him, blocking every possible exit. I was trapped. Marcus stumbled backward, dropping his heavy duffel bag full of stolen cash onto the carpeted floor. He looked frantically around the terminal, searching for a way out. His panicked eyes darted past the federal marshals and landed directly on the luxury first-class lounge seating area just across the walkway. I was sitting comfortably in a plush leather chair, waiting for his downfall. Marcus dropped to his knees right there on the airport carpet. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching as the federal marshals aggressively pushed him face down and locked heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. He had tried to run like a coward, leaving his mother and his mistress behind to face the federal government. But I had explicitly tracked his passport, anticipating his desperate flight. I gave the lead marshal a polite nod as they dragged my treacherous, embezzling husband away. His arrogant kingdom was officially reduced to a seized duffel bag of stolen cash and a one-way ticket to a federal holding cell. 3 weeks later, the grand jury officially convened in the towering federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was absolutely electric, buzzing, with reporters, legal aides, and curious spectators waiting to see the spectacular destruction of a supposedly untouchable family. I walked into the gallery wearing a perfectly tailored emerald green suit, my locks pinned up in an elegant, flawless crown. I took a seat in the front row, crossing my legs and resting my hands on my designer handbag. I looked completely unbothered, projecting the serene, untouchable power of a woman who had meticulously engineered every single moment of this reckoning. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the defendants were brought in. Evelyn looked absolutely horrific. The woman who had obsessed over her proximity to whiteness and high society status was now wearing a shapeless standard-issue beige jumpsuit. Her usually bone-straight hair was frizzy and unkempt, and her skin looked sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights. Marcus shuffled in right behind her, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. He could not even bring himself to look in my direction. Richard Sterling, the former billionaire titan of Wall Street, walked in flanked by two exhausted defense attorneys. His face was a mask of furious, impotent rage. The federal government had completely liquidated his assets to pay off his massive fraudulent debts. Then Jessica walked through the doors. Unlike the others, Jessica was not wearing a jail uniform. She was dressed in a conservative, expensive navy blue skirt suit, her blonde hair neatly styled. She carried herself with the smug, arrogant confidence of a woman who believed she had successfully outsmarted the entire system. Because she had actively cooperated with the federal investigators and handed over all the incriminating evidence against Marcus and Evelyn, the prosecutor had initially granted her a highly coveted immunity agreement. She genuinely believed she was going to walk out of this courtroom completely free, leaving her ruined in-laws behind to rot in prison. She actually had the audacity to shoot me a condescending, victorious smirk as she took her seat at the prosecution table. The lead federal prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah Jenkins, stood up and addressed the grand jury. She systematically laid out the overwhelming, undeniable evidence against the defendants. She detailed Marcus's massive corporate embezzlement scheme, explaining exactly how he had stolen millions from his banking clients to fund his fake, luxurious lifestyle. She presented the undeniable digital footprints of Evelyn's malicious wire fraud and identity theft, showing the jury exactly how my mother-in-law had forged my signature to secure a $500,000 loan. Then she dismantled Richard's corrupt empire, exposing the offshore accounts, the systematic bribery of city zoning officials, and the malicious real estate fraud targeting minority homeowners in historic neighborhoods. The grand jury did not hesitate. The indictments were swift and absolutely devastating. Marcus was formally indicted on 22 counts of federal embezzlement and fleeing to avoid prosecution. Evelyn was indicted on 15 counts of aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. Richard was indicted on 40 separate counts of corporate racketeering, bribery, and market manipulation. They were all facing decades behind bars. Jessica let out a soft, relieved sigh. She patted her attorney's arm, already gathering her expensive purse, fully preparing to stand up and walk out of the courthouse to start her new life. She looked over her shoulder, offering Evelyn a sickeningly sweet, unapologetic wave goodbye. Evelyn lunged forward, screaming obscenities at her daughter-in-law, but the bailiffs aggressively forced the older woman back into her seat. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Jenkins announced, her voice echoing sharply through the cavernous courtroom. "Before we conclude these proceedings, the government has one final critical matter to address regarding the cooperating witness, Jessica Sterling. We ask the court to review a newly acquired piece of evidence that was submitted to our office late last night." Jessica froze. The smug, victorious smile instantly vanished from her pale face. She looked at her attorney, panic wildly flashing in her eyes. Prosecutor Jenkins walked over to the evidence projector and turned it on. A massive high-definition document flashed onto the screen for the entire courtroom to see. It was a digital communication log, heavily encrypted, but successfully decoded by federal cyber analysts. As the court is aware, the witness Jessica Sterling was granted conditional immunity in exchange for her full and honest cooperation regarding the financial crimes committed by Marcus Vance and Evelyn Vance. Prosecutor Jenkins stated clearly, pacing in front of the jury box. However, immunity agreements are strictly predicated on the absolute truthfulness of the witness. If a witness actively conceals their own participation in a related felony, the immunity deal is immediately nullified. Jessica's attorney jumped up. "Objection. My client was completely transparent." "Your client is a liar," Prosecutor Jenkins fired back, pointing directly at the projected screen. We recently secured the full cooperation of Thomas Caldwell, the former chief financial officer of Apex Holdings. His encrypted communications prove Jessica Sterling was the mastermind behind the fraudulent real estate transfer. She orchestrated the sale to intentionally destroy the victim's historical property. The entire courtroom erupted in shocked gasps. Richard stared at his daughter in sheer disbelief. "Bailiffs," the judge ordered coldly, "take Jessica Sterling into immediate custody." The oak doors slammed shut behind Jessica, taking the last of the Sterling and Vance syndicate out of my sight. The grand jury had spoken. The justice system had swallowed my arrogant in-laws whole. I walked out of the courthouse breathing the crisp Chicago air, feeling a profound sense of liberation. My company was secure, my assets were frozen to me, and my ex-husband was trading his suits for an orange jumpsuit. My work was not finished. Taking down the corrupt people who tried to destroy me was only the first phase. The second phase was rebuilding the legacy they tried to erase. I signaled my driver to pull the vehicle around and instructed him to take me straight to Bronzeville. My grandmother's brownstone was standing safe from bulldozers, but the neighborhood surrounding it was still vulnerable. When I pulled up to the sidewalk, the diesel machines were gone, but the damage Richard's corrupted influence left behind was visible. Neon rezoning notices were stapled to the doors of my neighbors. The block was technically classified as a commercial hazard zone, a malicious designation. Richard paid the zoning board to enact. I walked up my porch steps and unlocked the wooden door. I set my designer handbag on the table and opened my laptop. I had completely seized Richard's corporate assets during the hostile takeover, which meant I now owned his digital archives. I instructed my cybersecurity team to bypass the firewalls on his private server. I was looking for the exact paper trail connecting Richard's offshore accounts to the municipal zoning officials. It took my analysts less than 2 hours to isolate the specific offshore ledgers. Richard had systematically wired hundreds of thousands of dollars to 3 key members of the City Planning Commission. I wanted to handle this situation completely personally. The next morning, I walked unannounced into the municipal planning office. I wore an ivory suit projecting the authority of a woman who now controlled billions in commercial real estate. I bypassed the receptionist and marched directly into the private office of Alderman Gregory Hayes, the corrupt chairman of the zoning board. I was sitting behind a cluttered desk, laughing loudly on the phone. When he saw me step into his office, his arrogant smile instantly evaporated. "Who let you in here?" Gregory demanded quickly, slamming the receiver down. "You cannot just barge into a restricted government office." "I am Kendra Vance," I stated, dropping a thick dossier directly onto his desk. "I suggest you lower your voice and listen very carefully to what I am about to tell you." Gregory scoffed, crossing his arms. "You are the woman who blew up Richard Sterling's empire, but you have absolutely no power here. That Bronzeville block is slated for commercial redevelopment, and there is nothing your corporate money can do to stop municipal progress." "Open the folder, Gregory," I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. He hesitantly opened the thick file. His eyes darted across the pages wide with sudden suffocating panic. He was looking at the exact routing numbers of his secret offshore accounts, cross-referenced with the dates he had signed, the malicious rezoning orders for my neighborhood. "You accepted $300,000 from Richard Sterling to artificially inflate the property taxes on historic black homes," I explained, leaning over his desk to trap him in my furious gaze. "You intentionally tried to force minority homeowners into bankruptcy so Richard could buy their ancestral land for pennies. That is a federal crime." Gregory began to sweat. His hands shook violently as he closed the file. "What do you want me to do? If I reverse those orders now, the city council will ask questions." "I do not care what the city council asks," I fired back. "You are going to log into your municipal database right now. You are going to completely reverse the commercial hazard designation for the entire Bronzeville district. Then you are going to fast-track the pending application to declare my grandmother's street a protected historical landmark. You will ensure that no corporate developer can ever touch those brownstones again." "And if I refuse," he choked out, wiping his wet forehead. "If you do exactly as I say, I will allow you to quietly resign from your position citing health reasons," I offered coldly. If you refuse, I will hand this entire dossier directly to the federal prosecutor who just indicted your billionaire friend. You will be sharing a cramped cell block with Marcus." Gregory did not hesitate. He frantically typed on his computer, his fingers shaking against the keyboard. Within 10 minutes, the malicious zoning codes were permanently erased. He printed the official city-stamped document, designating my grandmother's street as a protected historical landmark. He handed the paper to me. I walked out of the municipal building, holding the certified preservation of my family's legacy. I had successfully rooted out the corruption, secured my neighborhood, and protected my people. I returned to my corporate headquarters feeling a profound sense of closure. As I proudly sat behind my desk, David walked into my office. His face was grim, and he was tightly holding a crumpled, heavily stamped envelope. "This just arrived through the prison mail screening system," David said, handing me the letter. "It is from Marcus. He used his one allotted legal communication to send this directly to your personal attention." I took the heavy envelope, slicing it wide open. I unfolded the cheap prison paper. Marcus's handwriting was jagged and frantic. "You think you won, Kendra," the letter read. "You think you took everything from me, but you forgot who filed your joint tax returns for the last 3 years. Before I left, I planted a financial bomb deep inside your personal revenue filings. I buried offshore liabilities directly under your Social Security number. The Internal Revenue Service is going to tear your entire life apart, and this time your money cannot save you." Marcus was a coward, but a highly calculating one who spent 3 years handling my tax filings before I uncovered his embezzlement. He knew how to trigger a catastrophic government audit. I did not panic. I picked up my phone and summoned David into my office. I showed him the threatening letter. David immediately mobilized our corporate crisis management team. We expected a minor legal headache. We completely underestimated the sheer magnitude of the explosive financial device he had secretly buried in my history. The next morning, the reality of his threat materialized in the lobby of Apex Holdings. I was in a quarterly earnings review when my head of physical security burst into the boardroom. He did not even bother to knock. He informed me that 12 agents from the Internal Revenue Service had just walked through the front doors. They bypassed the reception desk, flashed their federal badges, and demanded access to the executive floor. I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and walked out to the elevators to meet them head-on. The lead investigator, a tall man who introduced himself as Agent Miller, did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He handed David a stack of official government subpoenas and comprehensive audit demands. Agent Miller looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. He stated that the Internal Revenue Service had received specific whistleblower information regarding massive offshore tax liabilities tied directly to my Social Security number. Marcus had expertly manipulated the complex tax codes, creating a dark labyrinth of phantom debts and offshore accounts using my stolen identity. He had executed it with the ruthless precision of a seasoned banking executive. Agent Miller did not care about my recent legal victories or my corporate reputation. He viewed me strictly as a high-profile criminal target. He informed me that the federal government was initiating an extremely aggressive audit of my entire financial history. The devastating blow came with his specific legal ultimatum. To prove that these toxic offshore accounts were fraudulently opened by Marcus, first had to produce the original, physically signed corporate ledger verification documents from 3 years ago. These hard copy files proved my signature had been forged. Agent Miller gave me exactly 48 hours to hand over those documents. If I failed to produce them before the deadline expired, the Internal Revenue Service would immediately freeze every asset I owned, seize my company, and formally indict me for massive federal tax evasion. The moment the federal agents left the building, my corporate headquarters descended into organized chaos. I authorized my new financial team to tear through every digital archive, secure safe deposit box, and physical filing cabinet we possessed across the city. We spent 14 agonizing hours searching the corporate vaults and secure storage rooms. My team analyzed every possible location, but the original ledgers were completely gone. The terrifying realization crashed down on me heavily. Marcus had not just tipped off the government. He had systematically stolen the only physical evidence that could exonerate me. He had looted my private home office safe in the penthouse long before the morning I kicked him out. By the second day, the atmosphere in my executive office was suffocating. David paced back and forth across the plush carpet, making desperate phone calls to federal judges, trying to secure a legal extension. Every request was aggressively denied. The Internal Revenue Service was treating me as a severe flight risk due to the volume of the alleged offshore capital. I had less than 24 hours left before my empire was violently seized by the federal government. My billions would be locked away, my spotless reputation would be destroyed, and I would be facing the exact same prison sentence as my corrupt ex-husband. Marcus was attempting to drag me down into the abyss with him from his jail cell. I sat behind my mahogany desk, rubbing my temples as a fierce headache threatened to blind me. I needed to think clearly. I closed my eyes and forced my brain to rewind time. I retraced every step Marcus took during his final chaotic weeks in my penthouse. He was deeply arrogant, but he was also incredibly lazy. He would not have risked carrying stolen corporate documents in his regular briefcase through my strict security checkpoints. He had to have smuggled them out using a different method. I went back to the exact morning this entire war began. The chaotic morning in my marble kitchen. The morning Brittany threw her dirty underwear directly at my face. I visualized the kitchen perfectly. I remembered Marcus running out of the bedroom screaming at me for putting my hands on his spoiled niece. I remembered Evelyn and Jessica barging through the front doors bringing toxic entitlement into my sanctuary. Then I remembered Brittany. When the police arrived and the chaos had peaked, Brittany was shivering violently. She had complained loudly about the cold air conditioning in the hallway. Before they were escorted out by my armed security team, Brittany grabbed a piece of clothing from the hallway coat rack. It was Marcus's heavy vintage college jacket. She wrapped it tightly around herself as she stood on the street crying over her life. My eyes snapped open. The sudden realization hit me with the force of a massive freight train. Marcus knew his time in my house was running out. He had meticulously hidden the stolen corporate ledgers and financial files inside the zippered interior pockets of his heavy vintage jacket, preparing to walk out with them later. But when I abruptly evicted him and the federal agents arrived, he panicked. He left the jacket on the rack. Brittany had unwittingly taken the jacket with her when she was thrown out onto the street. Marcus had completely lost track of his own stolen evidence because his spoiled niece had used it as a blanket. I knew exactly where those missing documents were, and I had 12 hours to get them back. I ordered my cybersecurity team to track the GPS signal on Brittany's cell phone. Since Marcus purchased her phone on our joint plan, my administrators still had backdoor access to the location services. Within 15 minutes, my head of security placed a tablet directly on my desk. The blinking red dot was perfectly stationary at a dilapidated motel on the far south side of the city. Jessica and Brittany had fallen a long way from their $30 million compound. I quickly grabbed my crimson coat and signaled David to follow me immediately. We had less than 11 hours left on the strict federal deadline. My driver broke multiple speed limits, getting us to the rundown motel. The crumbling building was surrounded by cracked asphalt, broken beer bottles, and flickering neon lights. We walked up to room number 12. I knocked loudly on the peeling wooden door. Jessica opened it, looking absolutely haggard. Her highly expensive designer clothes were stained, and her blonde hair was completely unwashed. Seeing me standing there with my lawyer and armed guards, she panicked and tried to slam the door. My lead guard stepped forward, planting his combat boot firmly against the rotting wood, forcing it wide open with a loud crack. We walked into the cramped, foul-smelling room. Brittany was sitting on a stained mattress, eating cheap fast food out of a styrofoam container. She froze when she saw me standing in her pathetic new reality. I demanded Marcus's vintage college jacket immediately. Brittany sneered, crossing her arms defensively. She looked at me with absolute contempt and told me she did not have the jacket anymore. She explained that when her credit cards were frozen and she was kicked out of her university housing, she rented a cheap storage unit under a fake alias to hide her remaining bags, shoes, and expensive jewelry. She admitted she had thrown Marcus's ugly old jacket into one of those moving boxes because she thought it smelled like cheap cologne and stale cigars. I held out my hand fiercely, demanding the physical key and the access code to the storage facility. Brittany laughed bitterly, leaning back against the filthy headboard. She told me she would only hand over the brass key if I immediately wired $50,000 into a clean, untraceable account for her and her destitute mother. She actually thought she possessed genuine leverage. She genuinely thought she could extort the woman who had just single-handedly dismantled a billionaire's corporate empire. I looked at David. He calmly pulled a drafted legal document from his briefcase. I looked directly at Brittany and explained the harsh, unforgiving reality of her desperate situation. I told her she was currently holding physical possession of stolen corporate property that was actively being sought by the Internal Revenue Service in a massive federal tax evasion investigation. I informed her that if she did not hand over the key in the next 10 seconds, I would call Agent Miller directly and report her as a knowing accessory to massive federal tax fraud. I promised her the ruthless federal agents would not just raid her secret storage unit. They would aggressively drag her out of this cheap motel in heavy steel handcuffs and formally charge her with obstruction of justice. Jessica screamed at her daughter in absolute terror to hand over the key. Brittany's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. Her hands shook violently as she reached deep into her designer purse and pulled out a cheap brass key and a crumpled piece of paper with a handwritten access code. I snatched the key from her shaking hand and turned my back on them without uttering another word. We raced across the city traffic to the remote self-storage facility. It was a massive windowless concrete building located in a desolate industrial park. My security team breached the heavy front iron gates using the exact access code Brittany provided. We sprinted down the brightly lit concrete hallways, scanning the metal doors for Unit 412. We had exactly 2 hours left before the unforgiving federal deadline expired. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. We finally reached the correct unit. I shoved the brass key into the steel padlock and yanked the metal door upward. The unit was packed tightly with stacks of Louis Vuitton suitcases, expensive garment bags, and velvet jewelry boxes. My security team immediately started tearing through the towering piles of luxury luggage. We ripped open expensive bags and threw countless designer clothes onto the dirty concrete floor. We were rapidly running out of time. I grabbed a large, heavily taped cardboard box hidden deep in the back corner. I ripped the packing tape off with my bare hands. Sitting right on top of a pile of designer sweaters was Marcus's vintage college jacket. I pulled it out quickly, my hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. I laid the jacket flat on the cold concrete floor. I ran my fingers anxiously along the interior lining of the dark fabric. I felt the thick, unmistakable stiffness of heavy paper, completely hidden beneath the seams. I grabbed a pocket knife from my guard and slashed the inner lining wide open. 3 thick manila envelopes fell directly onto the dusty floor. I ripped the first envelope open. Inside were the original physically signed corporate ledger verification documents, absolutely proving my signature had been forged by Marcus. But that was not the only thing my treacherous husband had hidden. I eagerly opened the second envelope and pulled out a massive stack of handwritten accounting notes. Marcus had meticulously documented his entire offshore tax evasion strategy in his own distinct handwriting. He had created a detailed roadmap showing exactly how he manipulated the complex tax codes to specifically frame me. I looked at David, a bright, triumphant smile breaking across my face. We had successfully secured the exact evidence needed to clear my name and send Marcus to a federal prison for the rest of his life. I handed the manila envelope directly to Agent Miller the second he walked into my boardroom the following morning. He spent 5 minutes reviewing the handwritten ledgers and original forged signatures. The aggressive demeanor he carried 24 hours earlier vanished. He looked at me, offered a curt nod, and officially closed the audit. My name was cleared. The federal case against Marcus was now loaded with absolute, undeniable evidence. 6 months later, the relentless gears of the federal justice system ground to a halt. The highly anticipated sentencing hearing was scheduled for a bleak Thursday morning in the United States courthouse. The cavernous courtroom was packed to maximum capacity. Financial journalists, corporate watchdogs, and curious spectators filled every wooden bench. I sat perfectly upright in the front row wearing a tailored, pristine white suit. The color was a deliberate, calculated choice. It projected absolute purity, total victory, and the unbothered grace of a woman who successfully walked through a blazing inferno without suffering a single burn. The heavy oak doors at the side of the courtroom swung open with a loud thud. The low murmur of the crowded gallery silenced. 4 armed United States Marshals escorted the defendants into the room. The sight was breathtaking in its brutal reality. Richard, the former billionaire titan who threatened to obliterate my existence, shuffled into the room wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were secured with heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the polished floor. The arrogant, untouchable aura he once possessed was gone, replaced by the hollow, sunken eyes of a thoroughly broken man. Evelyn walked in next, looking entirely unrecognizable. Deprived of her expensive chemical hair straighteners and luxury skin bleaching creams, she looked small, frail, and profoundly ordinary. Jessica followed her, staring at the floor, stripped of the smug, weaponized whiteness she used to terrorize me. Finally, Marcus was led to the defense table. My former husband looked completely pathetic, his shoulders trembling as he took his seat. The bailiff ordered the entire courtroom to rise. The Honorable Judge Reynolds, a stern, deeply respected African-American woman with decades of judicial experience, took her seat at the high bench. She looked down at the 4 defendants, her expression radiating uncompromising authority. This court has presided over countless financial crimes. Judge Reynolds began, her powerful voice filling the massive room. But the sheer magnitude of the malicious, coordinated, and prejudiced behavior exhibited by these 4 defendants is truly staggering. You did not simply commit federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate racketeering. You weaponized your wealth, societal privilege, and blatant racial prejudice to systematically destroy innocent lives. Judge Reynolds turned her piercing gaze directly onto Richard. Mr. Sterling, you built a massive corporate empire by actively preying on vulnerable minority homeowners. You bribed municipal officials to artificially inflate property taxes, intentionally destroying historic neighborhoods for selfish commercial gain. You operated under the arrogant assumption that your immense wealth placed you entirely above the law. You were wrong. She shifted her attention to Evelyn and Jessica. The 2 women visibly flinched under her intense scrutiny. Evelyn Vance and Jessica Sterling, your actions were fueled by a toxic, abhorrent sense of racial superiority. You committed identity theft, filed false police reports, and attempted to frame an innocent woman simply because you believed her skin color made her an easy target for your malice. Your profound ignorance and colorist entitlement have earned you a permanent place in the federal penal system. Finally, Judge Reynolds looked directly at Marcus. Marcus Vance, your crimes are defined by sheer cowardice. You embezzled millions from trusting clients, forged real estate deeds, and maliciously attempted to frame your wife for massive federal tax evasion. You manipulated everyone around you entirely to feed your fragile, insatiable ego. Before pronouncing the sentences, the judge formally asked if any defendants wished to address the court. Richard stared blankly ahead. Evelyn quietly sobbed. Jessica kept her head down, but Marcus stood up. His hands shook violently as he grabbed the edge of the defense table. He slowly turned around to face the crowded gallery, his desperate, bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. "Kendra, please!" Marcus begged, his voice cracking loudly in the silent courtroom. "I know I ruined everything. I was blinded by my own jealousy and greed. We were a family once. I loved you. Please tell the judge to show leniency. I am begging you. Please forgive me." The entire courtroom held its collective breath. Reporters leaned forward in their wooden seats. Marcus stood there crying pathetic tears, desperately hoping the submissive wife he thought he had married would suddenly reappear to save his miserable life. I did not say a single word. I did not smile. I did not frown. I looked at him with freezing indifference. Then, with deliberate precision, I turned my body entirely away from him, showing him my back. Marcus let out a devastated sob as the marshals aggressively forced him down into his wooden chair. "The time for leniency has long passed," Judge Reynolds declared, picking up her wooden gavel. "Richard Sterling for corporate racketeering, bribery, and market manipulation. I sentence you to 35 years in federal prison. Evelyn Vance for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. I sentence you to 20 years. Jessica Sterling for conspiracy and filing a false police report. I sentence you to 15 years. And Marcus Vance for federal embezzlement, forgery, and tax evasion. I sentence you to 40 years in a maximum security penitentiary. None of you will be eligible for early parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block with a loud crack. The sharp noise finalized their absolute destruction. The guards yanked them up, dragging the broken family into the dark abyss of the federal prison system. I stood up, smoothed my pristine white suit, and walked out into the bright city sunlight. My empire was safe, my legacy was protected, and my absolute justice was finally served.